Muy buenos días, muy buenos medios.
Good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to have you all, and to those of you that are following us via streaming. Let's start with the third meeting this morning of the Global Conference on Freedom of Speech for Latin America and the Caribbean, organized by UNESCO and OBSERVACOM. And let's start with the issues of communication and journalism. Rosa Gonzalez will start, and she has the floor right now. Thank you, Gustavo. Welcome, all of you. It is a pleasure to see you all around the table, and those of you that are online as well. I would like to welcome you. I wish you all have a wonderful meeting. I would like to start by thanking OBSERVACOM, the Latin American Observatory of Media and Convergence, and Gustavo Gomez for the support and energy that has been provided by all of them into this venture. Those of you who were with us last year, you probably remember that this was one of the big issues that we had to include last year, and that it was the big issue that still gathers us here today. That was reflected in the declaration, the plus 30 declaration, that maybe we thought it was not so important, but clearly we would like to tell you that after the participation of that statement, and with the participation of everyone who attended, this declaration was then endorsed by 193 countries, members of UNESCO. So this is where we saw that it became an international tool that was recognized as a common welfare, because it empowered our citizens. It recognizes the role of journalism in the communication and creation of information, and it recognizes the essential role of digital platforms when information is created. And finally, something that we recognize is that there are no easy solutions to the challenges that the information finds. There are some specific proposals that I'm not going to read because it will take us too much time, but one of them has to do with promoting, ensuring transparency from all interaction systems of the online content, such as service organizations and other requirements. So I think that it is important to ensure transparency and to try to avoid the issues that we have been dealing with lately. At international level, we have defined the principles and proposals to implement these processes, to show transparency indicators for the groups that have participated and for the civil society that have been able to implement the principles and reach more specific proposals that actually work. At regional level, from UNESCO, we supported several initiatives to have the civil society contribute more to this debate with the wealth of their knowledge and the perspective they have of users and of the human rights they have, and from a proposal that could be heard and that could be heard at national and regional level, and for that we carried out research work and different investigative reporting work that you can find outside about transparency, about privacy of contents, about institutionalizations, and of the process of finding agreement among the different sectors of the civil society that have finally reached a common declaration of agreement in terms of what would be the following steps regarding what the civil society should agree on. At least 22 civil society organizations signed that declaration. So briefly, the objective of this session is to hear about the consensus you have reached, and also beyond the civil society, to find the representatives of the platforms, digital platforms, so as to create a multi-stakeholder environment, and that we can reach and draw a common roadmap for this and then the next few years in order to promote transparency and learn how to do that. So I would like to congratulate you again, and I hope you enjoy this meeting. Thank you, Rosa. About the platform declaration that you just mentioned, and before moving on to the panelists, we will show a video that introduces the topic.
La transparencia y la rendición de cuentas de las grandes plataformas de Internet
es un derecho que tenemos todos quienes utilizamos estos nuevos espacios públicos en línea.
This is a right that we all have. We recognize that the platforms have made an effort in increasing transparency, and this progress is not enough. Transparency and accountability should be made, should be ensured through intelligent communications so that it meets international human rights standards. We commit to promote an agenda and a dialogue with other stakeholders to have more transparency, more freedom of speech online, and to empower people. And in this way, we can build a freer and more open Internet.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Faltó la firma del perro, pero...
Thank you. The dog hasn't endorsed yet, but we were able to gather different stakeholders that participate in this issue that are reflected there and in this huge diversity, and that we have to maintain and promote. We will give you the copy of this declaration. Is in English and in Spanish. I would like to ask my colleague Patricia Diaz. She is from the Dati Soft organization, and she will have the floor next. Yes, we have very little time, and we have a lot to say. So let's go to the presentation. This is the importance of transparency in platforms as a right of users and to have a more open and free Internet. We will listen to Vladimir Cortés first. He's an officer of the digital rights programs in Mexico, Central America. Maricarmen Sequera, she is a an executive director of TEDIC, the Association of Technology Development and Communication of Paraguay. And then we have Leah Hernández. She is the executive director of IPANDETEC, the Panamanian Institute of Rights and New Technologies. I will give the floor now to Vladimir Cortés, reminding him that he has 5 minutes. You have the floor, Vladimir. Thank you.
I hope this is not Pegasus, but because it was very odd. Well, after those initial noises and that opening, I hope it's not some bug that we are also talking about now. I'm Vladimir Cortés, Article 19. First of all, I want to thank OBSERVACOM and UNESCO for the invitation to be part of this panel that is crucial, really, because of what digital platforms mean now, what content moderation means now. To start by saying that transparency is a fundamental part of democratic society's historical struggle to finish opacity, to provide people with crucial tools to know the entrails of public power. It's our right. Transparency must be meaningful, not just refer to reports and figures, which are, of course, important and are significant. But when we talk about the digital space, it's something that rises from the right to information so that users know how digital platforms make decisions to moderate content. As UNESCO has warned, transparency means the dispositions of access to information and data and proactive dissemination. But platforms and social networks, this is not just a matter of yearly or monthly reports. The intercross in between human rights and access to content is a demand of international agencies and those who have requested it. We have rapporteurs and former rapporteurs who have stressed how transparency rules must account how and why they make decisions. They must include the international framework of human rights. And what we see now is also something that our colleague has called normative populism. And in front of those challenges for content moderation and the disinformation, which also includes transparency at the center, we must consider the harassment of freedom of information with all sorts of laws to silence journalism. To identify those challenges is a first step, but to propose solutions means to analyze what is the most proportional, needed, and efficacious measure, particularly when these initiatives at different parliaments are spreading now. Now, states need to identify the necessary least restrictive method to achieve the objectives of regulations such as pluralism and diversity of freedom of expression, considering evolution of digital platforms and the promotion and protection of human rights, including the right to free expression. We are at a time of definition, and we must point out that there is a consensus in the organizations to work towards transparency. Experiences generated in other places, such as the European Union, with the current discussion on the law of digital services, may mean a contribution not for copy and paste, which many of our legislators generally do automatically, but as a way to have a demand. We cannot think of a double standard that has higher protection standards in some countries, in the case of the European Union, and to think that still for the Latin American societies we are behind, we lag behind when we try to have a regulation of the digital platforms. So Transparency has become a consensus word. We need intelligent regulation pointed towards that or aiming to that. And nowadays, we are facing with this possibility now to generate this dialogue to say this is an important element on which states, rather than focusing on how to regulate contents and with ambiguous, unclear criteria such as fake news or other definitions that might restrict rights and legitimate expressions, we have a starting point. We have an element that allows us all, from our organizations and the civil society, to build this commitment and this route towards greater transparency. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your words and for keeping time. Now, Maricarmen has the floor. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, UNESCO and OBSERVACOM, for inviting us here and to allow us to participate in this discussion. From TEDIC, we are working and accompanying this declaration, and Vladimir has already said what are the focus and our concerns as civil society. So I would like to focus on some specific challenges from our organization, also to the coalition, regarding three issues. First of all, what we believe is the main challenge, which has to do with what type of transparency do we want, what are the indicators that we should have regarding transparency. And when we talk about algorithm transparency, our question as civil society is always what are we going to demand? The discussion is centered on whether the capacity of these platforms to facilitate this information is delivered in a code that us, at least, we cannot translate. We should be more intelligent and perhaps look for more specific ways to demand the information that we need. If we are sent a JSON today, a very specific file, we cannot do it. So what is happening really is that we will not have that capacity, and we will not be able to say that this information is not what we wanted or what we wanted within the algorithm. Another challenge within the same line has to do with content moderation, publicity moderation, and the challenge of academia. We know that in the global north there is a capacity for testing, for actual current analysis on these platforms, including northern platforms and TikTok in other continents. But our academia nowadays does not have the capacity to analyze and accompany these concerns of civil society. So that is a current challenge. How are we going to analyze those algorithms once we get access to them? And another concern has to do with something that is quite plausible in civil society and academia. The challenge is, what do we want once we have access? And regarding what approach are we going to have it, besides human rights, that request by economic groups and algorithm transparency regarding publicity. We should also analyze how those algorithms have an impact on our democracy. There are reports that say that it may have an impact, but in recent times, many companies funding publicity have denounced that these algorithms are not so efficient for the markets. Many of them have shown that in other platforms they have a greater facility to sell their products, and that is not because of their promotion. So they are questioning, and that leads us to wonder whether the efficiency of those algorithms really has an impact in voting, for instance. In South America, there are exploratory studies, Internet Lab. In Brazil, we have also carried out research in Paraguay on how that behavior changes at the voting day. And we believe that when we suggest transparency, we should also know how that has an impact that is real on our societies. To this time, all publications on our concerns regarding disinformation at the time of voting have not shown that people will really vote somebody other than the one that they really wanted to vote. They have not shown that they are induced by technology. We do not know if it is normal, but in the last elections, we could not conclude that they would have a real impact. So we really have that question on how plausible it is that they have an impact, and transparency should also be focused on those questions. Well, it also has to do with authorities for application. We have to think of a governance space where all the multi-stakeholder tables have the capacity to analyze this space, and on the other hand, a citizen audit of these application authorities, regional and national. And finally, I believe we are at a time to have an opportunity to generate indicators from the Global South with indicators that are suitable for our realities and capacities, and observing what is happening at the North, but concentrating on what we shall be able to translate right now. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Maricarmen. Now, Leah has the floor. Thank you very much. My name is Lydia Hernández. I'm Executive Director of IPANDETEC, an organization based in Panama City working on digital rights in Central America. I thank UNESCO for the opportunity and OBSERVACOM for the initiative to sign this statement on behalf of the civil society, some of the civil society members here. In IPANDETEC, the work we carry out, and particularly considering the fact that content moderation involves users, Internet users, regarding their rights as users of platforms, and what can we do to make sure that Internet is free and open. I think my colleagues have mentioned the main challenges we have from the technical regulatory point of view, but also the challenge of how to transmit, convey this information, and educate citizens on their rights in the use of platforms and what limitations they have to consider at the time of using them. Based on work we carry out in Central America, I dare say that most digital users in Central America have very scarce knowledge. And if we ask them about content moderation, it would be very difficult to explain what it means. So we should start there by educating and talking in a simple way to explain the users what are their rights on platforms and what are their scope, and not see that think that platforms are making an effort of a favor. In the Central American region, we must also consider that some countries, Honduras, Panama, Guatemala, have had legislative intents to regulate content moderation, to name it so, but it is generally based on the European models. And as was mentioned before, and as I always say when I meet legislators, although the European Union has regulatory models that may be replicated in the region, the needs of the European Union and the realities are very different from those of Central America. So we cannot do copy-paste of a project that involves or causes a confusion and a violation of the main fundamental guarantees of individuals in the region, which is what happens when MPs who lack knowledge on the issue want to promote this type of initiatives. And it is also very important to stress, as my colleagues have said before, that there is a conflict or lack of definition of the difference between access to information and transparency regarding other rights that might also be involved. And when people use the platforms, such as the rights of the protection of personal data and privacy. So what it means to have access to information might involve an invasion of privacy. So authorities must really exist and to take care of these interests, and that they are not authorities that want to lead really to promote agenda on content moderation, because I believe personally that these are issues that involve other sectors of society and government in our countries, and unfortunately they do not have the knowledge for this. It is also important to mention that the dialogue of platforms with digital platforms and with civil society is very fluid. We cannot say that we do not have contact with representatives of platforms in our region. Dialogue and conversation do exist, but how important is it for them to floor content moderation in countries in Central America, which in other issues have very limited and very slow times for response on different subjects called digital violence reports, online reports. Whenever we do them in Central America, the complaint as a region is to say that the time of response is very slow compared to the time of response in other parts of the world. So we should floor these issues in comparison to other parts of the world. That is very important, and panel members representing these large platforms and representing these companies' interest, they should tell us what they are doing to promote this dialogue, and not just with civil society as representative of users, but dialogues with users directly, because that is very important, because many of these organizations represent a sector of users, but we cannot reach every Internet user. What are they doing about it? And to make sure that this is just more than a form or a post or a publication on their own media of their latest figures. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the three of you. You have really covered a lot in your very brief presentations that they really stress the importance of transparency. Now I give the floor to Vladimir, who will moderate the next panel. Thank you very much, Patricia, and all the panel members for their speed and keeping time, really. I repeat, you have 5 minutes each. We shall now talk about good practices, commitments, and challenges for transparency in Internet platforms. And we shall have with us Raúl Echeberría, Executive Director of the Latin American Society of Internet, Amalia Toledo, Public Policy Specialist in Wikimedia, Carolina Aguerre of the San Andres University in Argentina, and Edison Lanza of the Inter-American Dialogue Rule of Law Program. Now, Raúl Echeberría, please. Good morning to you all. I finally managed to make some room here. I was worried when I saw that I arrived and I had no chair. And I said, well, maybe because I come from the private sector, they didn't leave me a chair. Sorry, Gustavo. But here we are. First of all, I wanted to stress some consensus. The initial video was very interesting. I felt represented, particularly when they said platforms have made efforts to improve their levels of transparency, but it's not enough. And I believe that that is perfect, because it's never enough. And Vladimir complemented that when he said that transparency is a main element as a basis of democratic systems. And I am very happy about many advances we have made in different areas, in the relationship with governments. And there is far more transparency, at least where I live, than decades ago. But I believe that we are never happy. We always want more. So I believe it is fine. I subscribe that idea that we have to work for more transparency also in this area, which is the area of how platforms work. We cannot discuss today all that has been mentioned, content moderation and other things that also are being discussed in other areas. I wanted to stress something to begin the conversation, which is in the declaration in point 9, which is to stress the positive side of digital development. Platforms, digital tools have contributed to a substantial improvement in giving voice to vulnerable populations, oppressed populations, independent journalists. Nowadays, the difference that we have in the capacity to exercise freedom of expression, of course, with obstacles and barriers that we face are enormous, but we have a capacity that we did not have in the past before these tools existed. Yesterday, I was looking at a Twitter dialogue between two Uruguayan journalists. One was promoting the event. Very well-known journalist was publicizing this conference and journalism under digital siege. And the other one said, "What do you mean digital siege? Up to now, I thought that digital was positive for us, so there might be a bias in that look. But we have to value what is positive, and we have to work in improving things, but not to destroy what we have already improved." More transparency is key for a public conversation that is healthy, and therefore it is also key for all the companies that are part of the Latin American Internet Society. That is why we are committed, and every dialogue and every opportunity we have, and here we have the Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression in the Americas, who is leading a dialogue on different issues, but one of them is content moderation, and we are highly committed to that process. We are doing our best, and if we can do more, we'll do more. And one thing that we think is fantastic of that process is that we acknowledge that part of the important is the quality of public debate, as Pedro Vaca says, and I do not want to quote him because he can represent himself, but he often says that if the quality of public debate is poor, then we cannot expect the representation of that debate in the digital world is miraculously good. Well, hence, there lies part of the problem, and we are committed to all things that might improve these conditions. Against what many people might think, or perhaps it goes without saying, user confidence is critical for the success of digital platforms. Content ones, financial services, they live on the trust of users. So this component of transparency is central in our agenda, and you will also always meet us there. There is already a multiplicity of tools available. Some might be available in one platform or the other, but there are many tools. There are two types of gaps. One gap is one of expectations. Well, are the tools enough for what we want or not? That is a gap. The other one is information gap. Many users and also organizations do not know all of the tools that are available. And in that information gap, I would say something that I heard in another session. Two speakers were stressing the cultural gap. There might be tools that are available, but not in the local language, or, well, the diversity of languages is fortunately very big.
So we really need to work on that to improve that. What are some of the problems that we face? Many times in some countries we try to promote transparency standards that are too specific and that are very different in other places. The strength of the platforms would be to offer a product that is global. Of course, with some adaptations, but not to have 100 different types of products and 100 different versions, because that will definitely affect the main reason for success. This is a justification to have this regulatory willingness to try to promote solutions that are not feasible. Because if those rules are implemented in some countries, then they have to be implemented in all of these other countries, and this is not feasible. So that's why it's important to be able to debate all of these issues through international dialogue. I don't want to continue to talk about this for much longer, but we have limited time. But I would like to finish by saying that transparency measures have to be reasonable and proportional, which means they don't have to be discriminatory of digital services compared to the physical services. Sometimes digital services required more transparency than physical ones. There are many transparency issues that are being required to platforms and to in-person media. There are many users sometimes of a platform that are required to do a certain thing, that are asked to do a lot of things. That doesn't happen with businesses in person. For example, restaurants. Restaurants are not asked on a regular basis how much money they bill a year, what is their annual turnover, how many people come into their business every day, etc. There are other measures that affect the core business. So you cannot ask me for the most successful dulce de leche recipe in Uruguay today, because that will affect the core of my business as well. So information sometimes is excessive. They require a lot of information. Sometimes this is positive, but that information is private to the company, and the platforms try to publish what they know. But if they have to publish 100% of the resources that they use and how they avoid protocols, it's really too complicated. I think that we definitely need to work together. We need to define standards together, and not just to create the standards, but to close the gaps existing among the different countries. And lastly, to work on the issue of regionality. We can take as many examples from the world we would like to take, but we have to develop our own approaches in Latin America. Thank you. Thank you, Raúl. Now we will listen to Maria Toledo. She's a specialist in public policies of Wikimedia. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here representing Wikimedia Foundation that works so that anybody anywhere in the world can freely share information, human information and human knowledge. One of our missions is to empower Wikimedia collaborators so that they continue to achieve what we work for, that is the defense, in this case, against censorship and the protection of privacy are essential in this process, because if we don't have transparency, if some information is deleted, or when people are afraid to share or informational or knowledge, then the available information becomes threatened. Wikimedia is a platform, and our foundation simply gathers everything that Wikimedia publishes. It's a non-profit organization that centralizes Wikimedia, centralizes and manages the Wikimedia communities. And transparency is essential, it's a key factor of this, not just the foundation, but also the communities that are the ones that maintain this movement open and alive. And transparency also helps this freedom of speech to be able to be exercised or implemented or used by all the communities. And one interesting thing that I heard when Raúl was speaking is that our foundation policy is to require minimum documentation. So that is, anybody can edit and can have an account in our platform. So we do not require many data when people want to open an account to collaborate with Wikimedia. And the information that we gather, in spite of that, the information that we gather is a lot. We have many active editors in different parts of the world. So for us, it's very easy to find collaborators. So it's really difficult to see why it's so different in other countries. Similarly, it's important to mention that ours are projects set and developed by the communities. The communities are those who elaborate the projects, and the community is the one in charge of applying guidelines and practices. They solve the disputes and conflicts arising from the information being included. So it is vital for us that it is the community, the one that arbitrates the conflicts that the community was not able to solve by itself. So, and each one of the claims made and petitions made are thoroughly analyzed to see if we can go back to the community. We try not to intervene and only intervene when the community cannot intervene. We simply check and balance conflicts and priorities, and we, as a foundation, we don't make decisions unless we have consulted the community so that the foundation can make decisions, and this requires transparency that is in turn required from us by the community. So there is trust, and the community helps us have this trust. The challenges, well, the challenges have to do especially with regulation. What we see is that around the world, especially in this region of the world, there are some regulatory proposals that are basically conceived to contain the power of the big commercial platforms, and we forget sometimes that internet is an ecosystem where we have not only sales or commercial platforms, and they have a lot of power, but there are also other spaces, other internet projects, and we are not even close to being opposed or to being contrary to regulation. What we think is, however, that the regulation has to be smart. It has to empower people and regulate them. It has to do with our model, that is a Wikimedia model, that is people know how decisions are made, because decisions are made by the community, and people have decision-making power, and that we want to have the processes that can force the community to adopt these decentralized models. We would like to continue with our decentralized model, that it is strengthened, so that we believe that transparency has to be used throughout. We know that the regulation that is coming out is going to help us to have better practices, and in this dialogue we can find different ways of finding methods towards transparency. Thank you. Now I will give the floor to Carolina Aguerre from the University of San Andrés. I will be brief. First, I think that we have said a lot of very interesting things. I wouldn't like to repeat them, but based on them to continue. Firstly, I think that it's essential to think and continue to move forward in a regulation agenda. I like to think more of governance in terms of transparency. Keeping in mind, of course, that transparency is limited, that we have some limitations when we say that our agenda has to be fully transparent. I believe that, as we said already, there is an issue that has to do with the communities themselves, but also with policymakers, that we all need to understand what happens in commercial and non-commercial platforms in terms of this moderation of content and the strategies and how they are affected not just by legal factors, but also by contents, algorithmic contents. Because when we think of this technology, we know that it means to have a lot of questions about transparency. That is, we know that transparency has limitations in terms of the technology. So I think that if we think of good practices, we need to fully understand what tools and limitations do we have when we ask for this transparency. So we need to keep in mind that transparency is an essential first step, but it's not going to be able to guarantee everything. I also believe that we need to move forward in our region. We have different states. We have regulatory agencies and public policies institutions. But we also need to recognize that they are not enough. And we as a region, we don't have enough weight still in the platforms.
Fomentando.
I think that we need to be able to continue to work in collaborative processes, regional processes, to strengthen regional mechanisms, even those that have to do with a more traditional internet governance, so as to be able to have a better impact on the big platforms. Because Tia spoke about Central America. Let's speak of Uruguay. We have 3.5 million people. In terms of users and volume, is not that relevant. So smaller states don't have a stake and a possibility to make an impact unless they work together as a community. And in this sense, I would like to say that only with regulation we will not be able to move forward as much as we would like to. There are other approaches that we need to take that have to do with different processes in different national, subnational, and regional layers, with monitoring and consultation instances, because we will never have the regulatory capacity that, for example, the European Union has to promote their legislation. We don't have those traditions in terms of rights, but also in terms of regulatory capacities. So I think that we need to emphasize the understanding and the capacity, not just to see what is going on in terms of capacity in theoretical terms, but also to develop capacities, in fact, at different levels, to continue to move forward among the regional stakeholders, so that we can all be more resilient, and the academia in our countries is not very well prepared to deal with this algorithmic transparency. There's very little work done with the civil society, and our civil society is very different from the civil society in the United States and in other countries. So the only way to work better is to show a more balanced distribution of power in our region. Thank you. Thank you, Carolina. So let's move on to Edison because we are a little late. In 5 minutes, what can I say? I can say that I agree with everything you said about transparency. And I think that this situation, firstly, I think that has been very well presented in 2019 when we published the joint declaration on the challenges for the next 10 years about freedom of speech. I was the rapporteur at that time, and I saw that the role of the state and the platforms is one of the most significant challenges that we had for open internet, and I think that we all agree.
Plataformas, digamos, tanto por
platforms by themselves, and because of what international agencies and civil society request, they have advanced and implemented many of these demands. Some months ago, with the Inter-American Dialogue, we launched a report on Facebook's oversight board, and an important news was that it is pushing for more transparency, even beyond what the platforms stated that they were making public. There were friendly conflicts between the oversight board and Facebook because in order to make certain decisions on content moderation, the oversight board demanded greater transparency to Facebook in concrete cases and on some policies. Therefore, there is a two-way path there that is interesting. I also wish to congratulate the organizations that are present here for this joint effort. I believe it is yielding very good results regionally. It's true we do not have institutions like at the European Union, but as a fervent supporter of the Inter-American human rights system, I believe that there, together with the UN, we have a space that perhaps other continents such as Asia or the Middle East do not have. So I believe for a subject such as this, we have to take advantage of it. I remember when in 2001 or 2 we started discussing the need for standards in access to public information. Do not believe that the current standards always existed. No, they did not exist. We did not have them. And back then, well, fortunately, societies take hold of the conquest of states. I remember the Oaxaca group that used to meet in Mexico to outline what were the germinal ideas of the principles of the access to public information, the Carter Center, where several of us participated, when in many important times that were steps so that perhaps 8 or 10 years later, the Inter-American law of access to public information was approved, and we have comparable standards now because of all that process. So I believe it is very important. We will not have a regional standard without a regional process. So it's important to push in that line. And finally, to mention somehow the debate that underlies all this, which is, well, how do we arrive at greater transparency that will generate consensus that is satisfactory and improves the quality of information available on the power of platforms and the importance of maintaining certain distinctions regarding the Internet. And I would say 2 things about that. First, that when there was regulation regarding transparency, I mean, that were sensible, platforms have complied with them. Not right now, for instance, we have the new law or Act of Services, of Digital Services of the European Union. But I remember that 5 or 6 years ago, Germany passed a law against hate speech with many demands on transparency. And I said back then that I did not agree with the intervention on content that law forced platforms to do. But it is interesting how through the years, the obligations of transparency, which were complied with by platforms because they have reported periodically, they have allowed the discussion of that law and about lots of information that we did not have on the incidence of states and platforms on hate speech in that case. And the Internet went on working. It went on being useful for Germans to a certain, in a good degree, and the obligation of transparency was fulfilled. Well, we could go along that path if we reach regional agreements on regional standards. And to close and to leave a question mark, of course, there's a lot way to go, because when you build transparency standards, you have to jump from principles to concrete regulations. And as Raúl said, we cannot go too much ahead and to make fulfillment or compliance impossible. And going back to history again, there is a series of dimensions that we should define in order to figure out if there is consensus. For instance, who are the obliged subjects? There has to be comprehensiveness. It's not just that platforms have to be transparent regarding content. The states also, because oftentimes through platforms, it's the states that determine what is blocked, what is filtered, what is put down. Who is bound, dimensions, how far to go, what type of information, what type of reports, the algorithm issue. I believe that shows that there is a path. But the interesting thing of this meeting is that sometimes the river has many turns, but it knows where it's going. And today we are showing that there is a way to go, and we know where we are going. Thank you very much, Edison. Gustavo, thank you, Fabian. We have the final 10 minutes, but it is somehow to look ahead. What initiatives do we have? What plan? What is the special rapporteur for freedom of expression thinking of? Or the social society organizations, what are they thinking of? Welcome, Pedro Vaca. Thank you for being here. Tell us what's the report on freedom of expression. When shall we have a model law? No, thank you very much. First of all, to OBSERVACOM and all the organizations present here at the UNESCO. And I start with something that is a concern for our office. There is a sort of mantra on these issues that we say, okay, we've got to work to make this compatible with standards of democracy and human rights. And it is not clear for me, actually. Is that an aspiration, or is that a current fear? Or part of what is happening in our environment seems to be really, we are losing what we understood as democracy and human rights. And I believe that this reflection is important because every actor at their level of responsibility and power also are accountable for whatever we are doing or not doing right now. It is a key time to work on these issues. From what we have seen in this year and a half, there are several processes in the region. There is a parliamentary anxiety that is important, and that is why a large proportion of the organizations present here and the Office of the Rapporteur have needed to tackle penalties in polarized countries, really. And there has been all sorts of things, express processes, decrease of the executive powers that try to change one day to the other how some components work, too long, structured processes, and particularly this one that has taken a long time, where The bitter message comes in these complicated matters of the insertion of an article that was never discussed, and it is inserted at the last minute, and it might hurt a whole process. And here I call for comprehensiveness of participation. These processes need many actors, but they also require that the insertion of the last-minute article may be common in our democracies, but it is something that may sacrifice processes of discussion. And I'm not talking about content moderation or transparency alone, but it is important to talk about some basis for discussion. Something that I think is a challenge for this community, the one that meets around UNESCO, and perhaps that is why transparency and due process are so important. The external obsession or the external priority is around contents, harmful contents, hate speech, disturbing speech. I see a certain confusion between harmful speech and disturbing speech, and how that is sensitive when talking about limits to freedom of expression. Edison can talk about this better than I, but it's difficult to have an inter-American juridical framework of freedom of speech and expression that cannot be limited by heat of the moment discussions. And it is important to warn about another component that has to do with our community, and it is institutional propaganda. I don't know if you think like me, but we are living times when official propaganda and institutional propaganda is intense. And I close with two ideas. The first one is that the availability of human resources of the different interested parties is not equivalent. Civil society and industry, for instance, do not have the same type of communication as with the states and with all states in the regions. When you want to have a partner about human rights, they call government or Ministry of Interior ministries, but the availability is not there in all states. One thing is the information provided, and another thing is the minimum necessary information to safeguard democracy and human rights. And I think that is the path ahead. One of them is the dialogue of the rapporteur. We are really expectant and collaborating a lot from civil society in that inter-American dialogue that is really covering things wider than transparency alone. And we are confident that with your leadership, we shall find good ways to face these sensitive and important issues. To finish, just some minutes for the civil society member who has participated in this. From Intervozes, Olivia Bandeira. Welcome. Thank you, Gustavo. Good morning to all of you. First of all, I would like to congratulate UNESCO for the initiative to discuss transparency of platforms, and also for having invited me for this debate. I wanted to talk about the construction of an agenda for Latin America with the prospect of building a consensual agreement. Why to regulate platforms? Why to have a Latin American perspective? But I would also only like to stress the historical context of the region that has weaknesses in the consolidation of democracies that are affected by a historical history of lack of plurality, lack of access to internet, concentration of power, and it is still affected by digital monopolies and their impact on the circulation of content, and impact affecting particularly minority groups, Afro-Americans, women, indigenous populations, LGBT+, journalists, popular communicators, human rights defenders, who might benefit from an open, free internet, but are not benefiting right now. Faced with that, several organizations participated in this event, launched in 2019 the standards for democratic regulation of large digital platforms, guaranteeing freedom of expression online and a free and open internet. We have some exemplars here. It is the result of a wide debate of public consultations. Some of the key points of this document is the need for transparency of platforms. And from Intervozes, I would like to stress that transparency and accountability are not good practice examples, but they are duties, obligations of the digital platforms, because they are monopolies and oligopolies, and for having become services of public interest since they influence the public debate. So I wanted to stress that the duties of transparency cannot be considered a cost or a factor that does not allow for innovation or competence, as has been said sometimes, but that these private companies cannot be more important than guaranteeing public debate, the right of users, and freedom of expression. Since we launched these standards, we have been working on increasing the dialogue in Latin America. At the end of last year, the dialogue with UNESCO, we signed another statement that was accepted with different Latin American entities. This document says that despite the efforts of platforms that we recognize to increase the degree of transparency, advances are not sufficient, and they still violate basic rights of users. And it also warns that the lack of transparency fosters reactive, disproportionate public policies and abusive projects of laws that violate fundamental rights. Hence, the need to discuss the regulations so that we do not have regulations that violate human rights. Faced with this, the document also stresses the need for a proactive behavior towards platform regulation regarding transparency, based on this multi-sectoral dialogue that is wide and open, and that may have international agencies such as UNESCO and the Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression of the Inter-AmericanCommission of Human Rights. Yesterday, we had a good conversation on this issue in an event from Wikimedia, where I think we advanced on some issues and we reaffirmed the need for democratic regulations that are the result of a multi-sectorial dialogue in Latin America. In that sense, I would like to quote the project of law 2630 that is being discussed in Brazil now, which was mentioned as an important step that could inspire discussions in Latin America. And despite all the political difficulties in Brazil right now, it is being debated with a wide participation of civil society, and that has make it advance regarding transparency, accountability, and due process. I'm sorry, we have to close. Yes, just a few points. Also, yesterday's conversation showed the need to define transparency and what level we want to reach. And here I would like to enumerate some of them that we may discuss, such as transparency in the construction of policies for content moderation, considering the impact that they may have on fundamental rights, transparency on the number of users in the countries in the region, which is something that was accepted also, on the terms of use and moderation policies, on content moderation and decision-making, and the legal transparency, algorithm transparency, and in the way of governance, which is another issue that we need to discuss in depth. Just to conclude, I would like to suggest that we follow with our agenda to define what transparency with what, at what level, and with what governance model, developing a document that is more detailed or a draft for a project That might be a starting point for work in each country, always with a proactive, active attitude that may discuss governance and what type of transparency regulation should be regulated by national states, but also what could be a matter to be competition of international global agencies such as UNESCO. Thank you. Thank you. We close this event. Thank you very much. I'm sorry for the delay.